All right, hello and welcome everybody. I am going to be talking about roughly the first half of this Harlan Ellison's greatest hits book that I got. I haven't read a lot of Harlan Ellison before today, or before the last week or so. I read I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream once after I watched the Retsupre guys do coverage of that game. You know, the shorts, shorts. It's a medium length short story, whatever that means, right? It's not quite novella length, but it's not like a 2-page blip either. So I read that. Wasn't super duper impressed by it, honestly. I'll get to why a little bit later on. But I figured it was time to maybe try reading some more of his stuff. So I bought this collection of greatest hits. Which, greatest hits collections are always a bit of a crapshoot, right? It's what some person other than Harlan Ellison thinks are his best and most important works. And most important works are also kind of a goofy thing, too, because that can mean, oh, they got awards that, whatever, right? I mean, you can kind of get a feel for this book, and at the top here, there's a tagline from NPR. Love him or hate him, Harlan Ellison was a legend. Harlan Ellison was not a legend. Harlan Ellison was a real human being. In fact, it would be more appropriate or closer to correct to say he is a legend, but to say he was a legend is to pretend like is to imply that while he was walking the earth, that he was some kind of Johnny Appleseed or no, Johnny Appleseed was a real person too. So like Paul Bunyan, right? No, this is NPR, being mishmashy and garbage as they usually are. And then if you actually look at this, it's got like 3 introductions, and then it has a note on the text. Harlan Ellison's work epitomized and reshaped the speculative science fiction and horror genres across decades. Ellison's stories and novellas have been an inspiration to subsequent writers, and his impact can still be seen in contemporary television, culture, and literature. However, while these stories are outstanding works across multiple genres, they may contain outdated cultural representations and language. We present the works as originally published. We hope that you enjoy discovering or rediscovering these stories. So already, I don't know a lot about Harlan Ellison, but I know that he was kind of an inveterate annoying, inveterate. He says that, I read a quote from him where he said, gadfly is not the right word. I prefer something that is more live, troublemaker, desperado. And this, this basic, he says, he uses some naughty words kind of thing at the beginning feels like it's something that Harlan Ellison would scoff at best, when he was alive. So, it's a little little bit of trepidation going into this thing. Now, despite all the stuff that I say about the stories that I'm going to talk about this time, which will be about the first half of the book, overall, Harlan Ellison's writing, his prose, is excellent, if a bit chaotic, right? He has very vivid descriptions with clever and, often very visceral use of metaphor. He doesn't shy away from showing the most depraved, demented, and, awful aspects of, whatever subject he's writing about. He generally paces his stories well, although a few stories are kind of slow. But at the same time, I find that sometimes his tendency to be edgelordy, as we might call today, is a little bit off-putting, and sometimes he seems to be vulgar for the sake of vulgarity, which I think is, not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily improve a story. It can, but it often does not, and is often there just to kind of surprise or shock the reader, which, whatever. I feel like that kind of thing is best handed over to, 10th grade English teachers or something like that. The first story in this book is Repent, Harlequin, said the Ticktockman, which is one of his most famous stories. For some reason. Honestly, this story did not really impress me. It starts out with an extended quote from Thoreau's book Civil Disobedience, and then it ends with a reference to 1984, which kind of feels like name dropping. It's like it's trying to sound deep while not actually being deep. It feels fake to me. And the bulk of the story is kind of about this silly toy tyranny where lateness, being late for something or being out of schedule is the greatest sin. There's three characters in the story, which one of them is Harlequin, one of them is the Ticktockman, another one is the woman Alice, I think, who betrays Harlequin. And none of them are really developed. We learn that Harlequin is someone who is just kind of habitually late and doesn't really have a good sense of time. We learn that the Ticktockman gleefully and without any, compunction, just randomly kills people when their time is up. And Alice, we barely get more from her than a couple of lines. None of these characters are really particularly interesting. It's fun to see Harlequin drop some jelly beans onto the moving street walkway thing and see it get gummed up. And some of the ideas of like the heart-stopping plate, cardio plate or something, I think they call it, is kind of a neat idea, but I mean it's just window dressing, really. And then we have a very strange conclusion where, okay, it's established in this story that the Ticktockman has no problem killing people for being late. When their time runs out, he stops their heart. Fair enough. So why are we pretending that his choice for dealing with Harlequin is kind of, like he refers to it as some kind of like 1984-esque torture and in the end, Harlequin comes out and he's not late anymore and he's happy and whatever. Nobody in this story, since everyone is set to work on this particular schedule, nobody in this story, including the Ticktockman, really has free will. And so the idea that, putting this guy into a thing that turns him into a model citizen is so abhorrent compared to killing him is kind of, I don't know, it's kind of weird to me. I was like, well, I mean, first off, there's no clear reason why you have to torture someone to convince him to not be late. There's probably types of training that wouldn't be torture that would do that, but, in the end, the Harlequin himself seems happy and well-adjusted, which, I mean, nobody in the story had free will at the beginning, and nobody in the story had free will at the end, and so I don't feel any real, what's the word? Like sadness about this change in Harlequin's character. So, whatever. First story, I'm like, okay, this is a famous story for whatever reason, but it feels very fake and toy-ish to me. The next story is I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which I've read once before, but it was years ago, so I went into it with as open a mind as I could try. We end up with a story of another weird tyranny. And, this one in particular, Repent Harlequin is not a particularly dark or gory or visceral story, but I Have No Mouth is. And at the same time, it seems to be dark for the sake of darkness, often vulgar for the sake of vulgarity, and it's kind of the edgelordy quality of Harlan Ellison's writing that I'm discovering that I like the least, whereas I like the stuff where he's not trying to do that the most. Again, the characters aren't really that interesting or well-developed. The pacing of the story is kind of slow. The one thing about this story that became a meme was the famous speech, right? The hate speech, right? Where if you inscribe the word hate on every nano angstrom of every blah 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 blah, which basically, as a physicist, is like Planck's constant is very small, my hate is very large. Behold, right? It's fun, but it's not really meaningful in any sensible way. It seems odd to me that the characters discover their solution to the problem of being tortured by Am only after enduring, 100+ years of Am's bullshit, which, there's no evidence that they wouldn't have thought of this, 99 years earlier, or they say they've been in there for like 105 or 110 years or something like that. And then we get this scary Kafkaesque conclusion that everybody knows about, and, it's funny, this story is a short story, and so you don't expect the most complex plot, the most, carefully developed characters. You don't really expect to see character arcs, but you do expect the characters to have like a meaningful goal or a reason why they didn't do the thing they do at the end of the story a long time ago. Now, in In the game, surprisingly enough, which Harlan Ellison actually voiced Am in the game, so it's kind of a fun little factoid. But the game constantly teased that Am was offering the characters some chance at an out. Maybe they get shunted out into a destroyed landscape of Earth, but at least they're free of Am. But in this story, there's not really any suggestion that that's a possibility. Am never really teases them. He just kind of is poking at them and, torturing them, mostly with starvation and stuff like that. And, it's funny that the story that the game introduces an additional layer of depth to the story that actually justifies the characters continually trying to, either placate Am or kind of play along with him, right? If Am never suggests to you that you have a chance of getting out and even eking out kind of like a basic survival, farm on the barren surface of the Earth, then why would you tolerate his torture for over 100 years? It's that element that makes it make sense that you pushed on for 100 years before deciding to take the out that happens in the story. So again, this story is interesting and fun, but again, it's also a little bit edgelordy and a little bit meh. It doesn't I don't know, it doesn't impress me as much as some of the stuff I read later on. The next story is impressive because it is the pinnacle of trolling in fictional form, as far as I can tell. The story is called The Deathbird, and it is written in this bizarre way where there's like a story tucked in between a bunch of sections that are like pseudo tests. Like, here's a multiple choice quiz about the stuff that's going on so far. Here's write an essay about this on the blah, 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 blah. It's very weird. It's very chaotic. It's clear that Harlan Ellison is very much trying to play with the reader or toy with the reader and the reader's expectations, which actually makes things interesting in a way, right? And then at the very end of the story, it closes with the phrase something like, "This is for Mark Twain," and it's written in block letters, which Ellison has explained earlier in the story are like the way that you describe the things that some divine being says or something like that. It is a weird ending to the book, to the story, and maybe it's referring to something that Mark Twain said at some point, some quote that I just don't know about. It's beyond my literary ken, if you will, but it is a weird story. But it's based on a very interesting, not very interesting, but a good concept. Good concept is invert good and evil between the ancient gods and the current gods. So, as opposed to someone like Lovecraft, who wanted to build up fear of these ancient gods coming back, and the current god either didn't exist or wasn't really much of a help, in this story, the ancient gods are the good guys, and, the Christian god is the bad guy. And, that's an interesting concept to play around with, sure. And here we actually start to see some characters who are deepened and developed. We have Nathan Stack, who is kind of like the last living human being. And then we have the snake, or Dira, who is a messenger from the old gods, who is the only one who knows the truth, which is that the current god is the mad one, and the old ones were not. The setting is dark without being too, vulgar or, needlessly graphic or edgelordy or whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, the end is kind of chaotic. And, because it has all of these inserted bits of like, here's a multiple choice quiz, write an essay about this, and then the very ending where it's like, this is for Mark Twain. It's like, huh? It's a little bit incomprehensible. And to be fair, Harlan Ellison always said he loved creating chaos in his writing. And this is, I think, probably the best example of chaos in his writing. So, this one I start to give thumbs up. Like a real thumbs up, and not a like, I can take it or leave it, right? The previous stories aren't bad. They just kind of aren't, they don't impress me as much as their reputation, suggests I should be impressed. Fair enough. The next story is called Chatting with Anubis. This is another short one. And it again kind of deals with the idea of the ancient gods being the good guys and the current god being the bad guy. So we're playing with that same idea. Fair enough. the story is about two people who kind of dig into this mysterious underground stone temple that kind of arose during like a freak earthquake. Right? This was an earthquake, and all these rocks come out of the ground, and people are like, oh, there's some kind of a thing down here. Now, one of the things I don't like about this story, chatting with Anubis, is that we get more name dropping, right? In Repent Harlequin, we had the Thoreau quote, we had the reference to 1984. In this one, he starts name dropping like random stuff. He's like, oh, we got our NMR machines from Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which Sandia isn't technically in Albuquerque. It's north of, but like, I don't care where you got your NMR machine. It's not relevant to the story. And the fact that you know that there are scientists at Sandia is not impressive to me. Okay, fine, whatever. But the cool thing that happens in the story is that these two people meet Anubis, and his job is basically to keep one of the new god's avatars from ever reaching the afterlife. There are some cool horror elements to this story that I think are fun. There's some kind of body horror stuff going on. Not body horror, but one of them falls into this thing and is torn at by the souls of the long dead something or other. It's got some cool moments in it. It's not like trying to offend. It's not trying to make you feel ill or anything like that, right? And so it's kind of a good story, and it's short. It doesn't. The characters don't need to be developed that much, but they go through an interesting experience, and they learn something interesting about the world of the story, which it makes for a good short story. And then, of course, once they've learned the secret, the temple vanishes again. And, even if you try to dig up the area where you found the temple that time, there's just nothing there. So kind of a neat story with an interesting kind of plot and some fun ideas going around in it. Very short, but effective for being short. So another thumbs up on that one. Next, we have The Whimper of Whipped Dogs, which was written after the murder of Kitty Genovese, I don't know, in 1964. There was a brutal murder in, I think, Queens, New York, where this woman was killed in like the foyer of her apartment building, and people knew it was happening, but they didn't do anything about it. And again, in this story, Ellison goes as dark and depraved and visceral and vulgar as he possibly can. He's kind of suggesting that the city somehow is a monster god that makes you give up your purity to live within it without being harmed by its evilness. Which, okay, look, you might call the people who didn't help Kitty Genovese depraved. You might say that what's the phrase? Depraved indifference, right? But here's the thing. It's not the city being a dark god that causes the people in the city to become depraved indifferent toward each other. It's the people who run the city that do this, right? They make it so that you can't, that if someone busts into your apartment and attacks you, that you can't defend yourself, and if there's a possibility that you might run away. And if you can't defend yourself, then why would you put your life on the line to defend somebody else, especially if the tools that you could use to defend yourself or others are also denied to you by the same group of people that run the city. It's very funny to kind of take that responsibility and push it off to this fake god of the city that doesn't really exist. And, the depravity of the people is actually the product of the people that, you may have encouraged to be rulers of the city. It's just, it's one of those things where it's like you get really angry about something, and so you write a story, but like you fail to see the chain of events that led up to the event that you're angry about, and you make the same mistake that leads to more of it happening in the future. So, that one is again very dark and depraved and vulgar, but it's also not, it's done to not just a non-purpose where like the story doesn't really go anywhere, but to a purpose where it's contradictory, right? Like this is not something that the city did on its own. This is something that the people of the city did to themselves. And for them to push that responsibility off to some fictional being is, I think, irresponsible. So this one's actually the first like significant thumbs down. And then we get out of this section of like dark gods or something. They spread this book out into like 4 sections, angry gods, and we go to Lost Souls. Now, the first story in Lost Souls is, I think, the best one that I've read so far. And this one is called Jeffty Is Five. This is the first story in the book that I really enjoyed and like actually got into. And it's interesting because, well, let me just explain it. So the idea of this story is that it starts out with the main character, the POV character, saying, this kid Jeffty that I, met when I was 5 years old and we were friends, he doesn't age. I do, but he doesn't. And so Jeffty remains 5 years old as the POV character ages. And the way that it's written early on, you kind of think, you're kind of getting the idea or the impression that it's not that Jeffty's not aging, it's that he's just kind of, slow, right? But then Ellison kind of dispels that in the bluntest way possible. And it's like, no, I don't mean he's, but I mean he's actually not aging. And at that point, the story kind of takes a sci-fi, Twilight Zone-esque kind of direction, and it actually gets really, really, really good. Because what's happening is that Jeffty is kind of maintaining an aura of the past around him, right? So, like, it takes a long time for the main character to realize this. He's in his, 20s or 30s when he discovers this, and somehow he's still maintained kind of this friendship with Jeffty. And what he discovers is that around Jeffty, right, radios, for instance, they play not just reruns of old shows, but actual, new episodes of shows that haven't really been on the air for 20 years. And so, the main character's like, holy crap, there was this radio show that, went off the air 20 years ago, and now I come in and I hear Jeffty listening not just to the show, on rerun, but they're actually making new, his radio is actually producing new episodes of this show with actors who are long dead starring in it. And it's like, it's this really cool kind of okay, what's going on here? It's very mysterious. And at the same time, Ellison is kind of pushing this sense of the fragility of this little tiny bit of the past that still survives in the present. And, then we start to get into the question of Jeffty's parents. And Jeffty's parents are aging. And, they expected the kid to grow up and kind of go off on his own. And now, 20 years later, it's become clear that Jeffty's never going to be able to take care of himself. He's always going to be a little kid that is at the mercy of the world around him. And so they kind of, get described as, on some level, feeling as if they're kind of trapped with this Twilight Zone creature that will always be a burden to them and will never be able to help them, in their old age. They'll wither and die, and they'll leave him alone, and what will happen then, kind of thing. It's very kind of depressing and scary, honestly. It's like, we love him, but we can't protect him forever. So what do we do? We're not rich enough to create a trust where he'll be able to live on, on the product of the trust for forever. It's and so there's this whole conflict going on. And then at the very end of the story, past meets present, catastrophe results. And I won't spoil any more than that, but I'll just say that it was really, it's got a lot of kind of ambivalence going on. There's a lot of action happening and events meeting that shouldn't have met, and then you get to see the result of that. It's really well done. And so this story is an enthusiastic thumbs up, absolutely. So far, I mean, I've still got half the book to read, but so far this is the best. This is the one I've enjoyed the most. Let's see, the next story is called Pretty Maggie Moneyeyes, and this is another very interesting, very simple horror story. There's a man whose name is, I believe, Costner with a K, not the actor. But if they were going to do an adaptation of this, we'd have an idea of who the actor could be. I don't think we get his first name, but he's just this guy named Costner who's down on his luck. He's in Las Vegas. He spent all of his money, and he's down to his last silver dollar, which he throws into a one-of-a-kind slot machine and wins the jackpot, which is $2,000. And then, he takes one of those things and puts it back in and wins the jackpot a second time. And there's this really cool kind of interplay between him and the casino, because the casino's like, are you cheating? And he's like, no. And they're like, can we check? And he's like, sure. And so they check the machine, The casino owner has this really interesting scene where he's talking with Costner about the situation, and he's like, I can't throw you out, which is different from how casinos are today, as far as I understand. But like, he's like, I can't throw you out. I can't stop you from putting money in that. But what I'm asking you to do is to go, take a break upstairs for 10 hours. We're going to take the machine apart and make sure it's not broken. And, then it's also stated, kind of, narrator basically states that during those 10 hours, they also rifled through all of his clothing and stuff like that and looked for any kind of, stuff he was using to cheat the slot machine that way. And like, they don't find anything that he's cheating. And interplayed throughout this kind of main present plot, we get something that's happened in the past, where this woman named Maggie, she's like half Cherokee, half European, and she had kind of this really crappy life, and through a series of events, she kind of ends up. What we're told that it's like her soul gets drawn into this slot machine, which is, not particularly well explained, but it's a very simple horror story, so I'm willing to kind of give it that pass. And for some reason, she's decided that Costner is the person who deserves these jackpots, and she's going to give them to him. And, she has this very sad story, and in fact, she herself died trying to play that slot machine, and then the whole thing kind of comes together and turns into this very simple, like, satisfying isn't the right word, but a very simple, reasonable, good horror ending that, plays around with expectations that you have throughout the story, and I think is pretty solid. So, pretty Maggie Moneyeyes. Another thumbs up for doing something cool in a very short span of time. So, there we go with that. Next, we have Shatterday, which was actually, according to what I can see, was made into a Twilight Zone episode, where a guy is basically sitting at a bar waiting for his girlfriend to show up. And he accidentally, he's going to call her, but he accidentally calls home, his apartment. And believe it or not, someone picks up the phone. And it's not like a burglar or, a neighbor or something like that. It's him. He picks up the phone. And so, like, we never really get the initial confrontation, right? Like, he calls home and he answers, and he talks to himself a little bit, and like, questions arise, right? Well, okay, assuming that both of these versions of him exist, can they both exist at the same time forever, indefinitely, right? Which one is the original? Which one ought to continue to exist if only one of them can? And so there's a very interesting plot that takes place over the course of a week, where, our POV character is doing all this stuff to basically try to like, make sure that he still has, spending money and stuff like that, because he can't get back into his apartment, because the other guy is there. And the other guy is doing stuff too that we get described, and things like that. And, well, honestly, I can't say much more about this story without spoiling the point of it, which, let's just say that it plays around with a reader bias that I think is interesting. And it does so in an interesting way and in a satisfying way at the end. So, I'll leave it there for that story, but because if I say anything else, it'll be like, oh, this is what happens, right? But I do think it was a solidly written, solidly produced story with an interesting point that it makes to you, right? So let's thumbs up for Shatterday as well. Now, this is getting kind of long, so we're on our last story, and this story is called Mefisto in Onyx. And, this story also has another separate content warning at the start of the story. And, when I saw that, I was like, okay, this is, getting a little bit out of hand here, where they're like, oh, be careful, this story has naughty words in it. And it's like, fine, whatever. But if you can get past that, it's otherwise a very interesting story. It kind of deals with the, so the basic story is about a guy who can read minds. And there's this serial killer, and a woman that the mind reader guy knows, is kind of convinced that he's innocent. And in this story, which is not actually that long, there's surprisingly good character development in this story for how short it is. We get a lot of information about the main character, we get a lot of information about his friend, we get a lot of information about this supposed serial killer, and basically, this woman wants him to go and meet this serial killer and determine whether or not this guy is actually guilty of his crimes or not. And of course, there's also a very strong issue of race relations in the story as well, which is where the naughty words come from, right? But again, if you can get past all that, this story is really well made because it keeps you guessing throughout the whole thing, all the way from the first third of the story where you start to actually get an idea of what's happening, all the way to the end. Things get switched up and moved around and twisted around so many different ways that you just keep guessing throughout the whole story until the very end. And even the very end is wait, what? Kind of an ending, right? Where you're not quite sure that what you were told in the second to last sentence of the story actually was what happened in the second to last sentence of the story. And so, we get multiple twists. Some of the twists are a little hard to believe, right? What ends up happening, I'll try to get to it without spoiling too much, is that the guy comes up, the mind reader guy comes up with an idea of who actually committed the crimes, and the question becomes a little well, wait, couldn't this guy, if there was this other guy who committed the crimes, wouldn't he have had some kind of, or if he didn't, right? If he gets a false idea of who else committed the crimes, wouldn't there be some kind of an alibi where it's well, yeah, I didn't anticipate, being questioned about this murder that happened at this date on this minute in this hour of this day, but I can tell you that I was at the grocery store and I saw a friend of mine, especially when you're dealing with a serial killer who, has got a kill count of 50, 70 people or something like that. It's, that particular twist is a little bit hard to believe that a good investigator wouldn't pick up on some kind of issue with that. Just oh yeah, this happened in Richmond, and I was, I had to go to the car mechanic in Florida that day, and blah 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 blah. But aside from that one small nitpick, it actually is really, really well done, and it, like I said, it keeps you guessing all the way up to the end, and it's a really solid story. So that one's another enthusiastic thumbs up as well. So that is what I've read so far. I'll probably do another second half of the book in a couple of weeks or something like that. But, I just figured it'd be fun to talk about Harlan Ellison a little bit, and, kind of get away from the ooh-ah kind of perspective where, everybody has to, because he's such a classic writer, everybody has to love everything he does and, kind of actually be a little bit honest about some of the shortcomings that I think were in some of these stories, because I thought that might be interesting. But anyway, that's what I've got for this week. So, as always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Have a good week.